If the 1960s were revolutionary times, the core of that revolution was race. Today, slavery is at the center of Americans' official history, with race the central concept in the country's official self-understanding. Never before the 1960s was this the case. The era we think of as the 60s began with relative suddenness around the time of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. In the immediate aftermath of JFK's death, Lyndon B. Johnson would pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was meant to deliver the coup de grace to Jim Crow, and to end the black marches and police crackdowns in Mississippi and Alabama that television viewers were seeing almost weekly. This act banned racial discrimination in voting booths, hotels, restaurants, theaters, public facilities, from libraries to swimming pools to bathrooms, and public schools. It also empowered the federal government to reform and abolish certain institutions that stood in the way of racial equality, as well as establish new ones. By subjecting to bureaucratic scrutiny any company or institution that received government money, by laying out hiring practices for all companies with more than 15 employees, by creating a new presidential agency, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, with the power to file lawsuits, conduct investigations, and order redress. By doing all these things, the act emboldened and incentivized bureaucrats, lawyers, intellectuals, and political agitators to become the foot soldiers of civil rights enforcement. On top of this, the United States has had two massive domestic policy programs that mobilize public resources and sentiments so thoroughly that the philosopher and psychologist William James referred to them as the moral equivalent of war. The war on poverty in the 60s and the war on drugs in the 80s and 90s. Both were mere battlefronts in a larger struggle over race relations. What made these new framers of civil rights different from those in the 19th century was their conception of power and their genius for wielding it. The folkways of the South clashed intolerably with mid-century Americans' self-image. Americans were civilized, modern, gentlemanly. Segregation was sleazy, medieval, and underhanded. The smugness and cruelty of the system was infuriating, and not only to blacks. Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, the unanimous Supreme Court decision of 1954 that ordered the desegregation of all the country schools, was not just a landmark decision but an unusual one. Shorn of footnotes and case references, each of its two parts ran about the length of a newspaper column. The justices had ignored the subject of whether the 14th Amendment, drafted in the wake of the Civil War to guarantee equal protection of the laws, had intended to permit segregated schools. Instead, the question raised was whether the doctrine of separate but equal, used to justify school segregation, was possible in practice. Even many ardent opponents of segregation were troubled by Brown's project to rewrite the American Constitution on the authority of vague pronouncements. In a 1959 article, Harvard Law School professor Herbert Wechsler described Brown as an opinion which is often read with less fidelity by those who praise it than by those whom it condemned, and also showed in depth how Brown would have been impossible under any faithful reading of what the drafters of the 14th Amendment had meant by equality. The heart of the matter with segregation was not equality but the conflicts it created with the First Amendment's right of freedom of association. Wechsler argued that, given a situation where the state must practically choose between denying the association to those who wish it or imposing it on those who would avoid it, is there a basis in neutral principles for holding that the Constitution demands that the claims for association should prevail? The Civil Rights Act introduced into the private sector the assumption that all separation was prima facie evidence of inequality. The First Amendment scholar, Harry Calvin Jr., tried to disguise his misgivings as praise when he described the Black Revolution as an almost military assault on the Constitution. The Yale Law Journal had written that the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had been allowed to take up a role in the various civil rights cases as a private attorney general. The NAACP not only staged events, but it scripted them as well. The plaintiffs it handpicked to carry them out were chosen for their sympathy and skill. The problem is that rights cannot simply be added to a social contract without significantly changing it. To establish new liberties is to extinguish others. In the summer of 1963, one anecdote from the Senate's debates described a hypothetical Mrs. Murphy, an old widow who rented out a room in her house in a northern city, who they argued might end up bearing the brunt of federal surveillance and law enforcement if she got too picky about whom she accepted as a tenant. Of course, the legislation's backers treated the question as ridiculous. Of course, the boarding house, unlike the hotels that would be covered in civil rights legislation, was Mrs. Murphy's personal property, with which she could do as she pleased. At the March on Washington in 1963, A. Philip Randolph, organizer of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and of the march itself, warned that real freedom will require many changes in the nation's political and social philosophies and institutions. For one thing, we must destroy the notion that Mrs. Murphy's property rights include the right to humiliate me because of the color of my skin. The sanctity of private property takes second place to the sanctity of the human personality. And so it was after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Property simply would not enjoy the same constitutional protection that it had before. Florida's segregationist governor, C. Ferris Bryant, was able to describe America's belief in the freedom of association, something he believed all Americans shared, as follows. We would all agree that the traveler is and should be free not to buy. He can pass a motel because he doesn't like the town, he doesn't like the color, or he doesn't like the name. He can stop and go in, and when he sees the owner, he can decide he doesn't like him because he doesn't like his mustache, or his accent, or his prices, or his race, or his other customers. He can turn around and walk out for any reason, or for no reason at all. Why not? He's a free man. So is the owner of the property. And if the traveler is free not to buy because he doesn't like the owner's mustache, accent, prices, race, other customers, or for any or no reason, the owner of the property ought to have the same freedom. That's simple justice. The wonder is that it can be questioned. It tended to be segregationists who philosophized in this vein. Progressive politicians were seldom comfortable conveying to white voters that, in exchange for civil rights, they were going to have to surrender certain basic freedoms they had until then taken for granted. Naturally, it was a delicate moment, and later we will see just how both white and black Americans viewed the civil rights movement, and how the movement would transform into the racial ideology of America today.